Doc Slab Audio on music production and audio engineering. Welcome to Doc Slab Audio and our Insights series. I do believe this is the 34th video in our Insights series, and in this video we want to talk about the art of reverse sound sculpting. This seems like a fairly simple concept, but why I'm making this video is because I've seen so many people, whenever they start trying to sculpt this sound, that a lot of times that they're not really looking at it from a proper perspective as far as I'm concerned, because they look at it as trying to remove issues or edit issues and trying to deal with things like that sometimes, but they don't really look at it as reverse sound sculpting. So the concept here is, I've talked quite a bit about sound sculpting in some of my series, but we've not really addressed this as per se sound sculpting in reverse, because a lot of times you'll get people, they'll do like subtractive EQ and things like that. They'll do work with compressors, they'll do work with expanders, they'll do with gates, limiters, there's things like, like the LFO tool that I have that's really cool. Sonic Works can be a really cool tool that can be used to do reverse sound sculpting with. Same with something simple like Ambio here from Sennheiser. There are tons of these tools that can do this. As far as we see it as repairing issues, but we're not seeing it in the correct light as far as I'm concerned, because a lot of times, besides just looking at it as issues, then it's an actual art form of being able to reverse sound sculpt a piece of audio when you're having detrimental content there that you need to address. And it's much better for your mind to look at it as reverse sound sculpting, because basically a really simple concept here is, let's say that I have a waveform, it's a vocal, and I'm really going after, like, say, the third harmonic in that vocal is a problem. And this individual, that third harmonic, as per se, just one area of sound sculpting, is an issue, and I have to attenuate it, and I have to use automation to follow it around sometimes, because otherwise it's adding this character to the sound that is not really pleasing, that is, could be natural in their voice, it could be of the capture because of some issue, resonances in the room, all kinds of issues, but it's more of a reverse sound sculpting because you're trying to attenuate that third harmonic, consistently throughout a performance to attain a sound that you're looking for. And so you're basically looking at it as a reverse sound sculpting endeavor and processing and editing endeavor. So it's really cool to kind of see it that way. That the reason why I brought this up, because besides just the basic tools we have in our DAWs, some of my favorite tools are RX and Melodyne. And whenever I get in there, that having this perception that sometimes I'm doing reverse sound sculpting first before I actually do sculpting is a really great way of looking at it, because I'm trying to deal with issues. There might be certain harmonics that might be an issue. There might be, modulation issues that are happening that I'm trying to reverse the problem there to attain the sculpted sound that I want. And I get into things like RX, that I might be doing things like deverb because there's too much reverberation there, and it sounds great, but it needs to be backed off a little bit to have the effect that I want. And it's more of a reverse sound sculpting. You can look at it as editing also, but a lot of times it's much better to have a view of it that it's reverse sound sculpting, because it's has much more weight that way. Edits are for problems you've got to click, plop, bleep, things like that, that are really simple things, and they get really complicated you can see by my downloadable notebook in the Abouts tab that it can be pretty complicated, and there's a lot of issues that could be happening. But when we get into a lot of this stuff, it's more of a reverse sound sculpting. And why I say this, anything that has to do with spectral repair, any of this stuff that you're dealing with in something like RX, or things you're dealing with in Melodyne that's able to reverse certain properties and correct certain properties, or attenuate them in certain areas and things like that, it's a reverse sound sculpting procedure to try to gain what you want out of the production as a finished product. And the cool thing about it is that then you look at it a little bit differently. So anytime that you go after a piece of audio that you've got some editing issues you may have to deal with, clicks, plops, bleeps, whatever. And then you're really starting to look at, do I have reverse sound sculpting things I need to do that I need to attenuate? Am I going to be able to fix this with sound sculpting? If I'm going to do additive EQ in some area to fix that, or am I working backwards? Do I need to do reverse sound sculpting? I need to do subtractive EQ. Does that make sense to attain what I'm trying to do, rather than boost the levels up in some area to deal with a problem area? Like you've got, let's say, here's a real prime example. Let's say I've got a few harmonics right in here that are a problem, just as an example. Now, these are up, let's say, a little bit. Now, the problem is with sound sculpting, if I go up in here and say, well, with those being up, I need to boost this up here, this over here, that over there, and this over here. I got to boost those up to get this down to the level that it should be, because that way that it sounds correct. And so it's kind of backwards, and I'm not really dealing with the problem more than likely across the spectrum of all the issues that are incurred, because I'm not really going about it the correct way. But if I go about it as a process of reverse sound sculpting, then I've really went after that issue. Does that make sense? And it's not so much of an issue, is that those are the levels that should be. If I sound sculpted it correctly to now it sounds right. It's not like fixing, an anomaly or a click, block, bleep or something like that. It's actually sound sculpting, but in reverse. And so I'm reversing that problem in the way I see it, because if I would have sound sculpted it, it would have been like that. So while I'm sound sculpting, it's an issue. I want to attenuate those harmonics, or the EQ or whatever, and I'm reverse sound sculpting. That could be with frequency modulations, all kinds of things, compressors, gates, expanders, any tool that you have that you use to sound sculpt. And it can be noise too. The problem, it's really hard to reverse noise. You get into something like RX, and you can do, de-bleed, and things like that, and use it in ways I've talked about getting certain noises out of the system by causing the system to think it's a problem in the audio, and it'll suck it out, and spectral denoise and things like that are a reverse sound sculpting procedure. So anything you're doing like that, the more you look at it as reverse sound sculpting, that it's still kind of sound sculpting, but it's a whole new way to look at it to get you to really get your mind focused on it that way. So you look at those areas while you're looking at sculpting and seeing where it would be better to approach and how it would be better to approach that, so that you're not overcorrecting or not fixing issues like I talked about with that harmonic content, trying to fix in a bunch of different areas because you're not attenuating some other area. That's not really a good way to go about it, because you're not really fixing it across the spectrum like you would when you would just go after that little area and everything's great because you would have sculpted it that way. So that way it gets your mind looking at it that way. So whenever you're going after audio and you're doing your sound sculpting and that kind of stuff, after you're done editing, dealing with, problems, clicks, plops, bleeps, and any issues you have, that you're really looking at it that way, to have that as part of your workflow, to really look at that and go, well, is this a reverse sound sculpting procedure, the problem, something I need to deal with, or do I need to sound sculpt this? What's the best way to approach this? Because there's things like breath control. That's a reverse sound sculpting procedure. You're having an issue there that more than likely it's not a really good idea to completely eradicate it if that's the way they naturally sound, but you may be wanting to attenuate it, and you're doing reverse sound sculpting to try to make it more pleasing the way that you want it to sound. Does that make sense? Anything that you use like that can be seen that way, and it makes you much more artistic in your approach to engineering when you're working, because you're not just looking as an editing problem, you're looking at yourself as an artist and a sound sculptor, and this is a reverse sound sculpting procedure that you're trying to make things more pleasing and more the way that you want it to sound. So I certainly hope that gets you thinking a little bit about reverse sound sculpting in a whole new way, and get you really trying to get that into your workflow, about seeing that as part of your workflow. And peace, self-love. I'll see you in the next video.